Cheers. I want to speak a little today about what I affectionately call the Lebanese language and about what my detractors refer to as a dialect of Arabic. There's an ongoing debate on social media these days, and I've been part of it for many years, but there's been a flare up a week or so ago, a debate pitting those who call the Lebanese language, and I'm one of those who call it a language in its own right. On one side, there are those fascists, usually, at least that's what they're called, and there are those who dismiss the Lebanese language and refer to it as a dialect of Arabic. My basic argument is a simple one. It posits that if Lebanese is a dialect of anything, it is a dialect of Canaanite and Aramaic, Canaano-Aramaic, a Canaano-Aramaic language that was pretty much the lingua franca of the Lebanese coast for upwards of 4,000 years. And I say Canaano-Aramaic so as not to cause the onset of apoplexy among those who are triggered by the term Phoenician. But for all intents and purposes, the language that the Lebanese speak today is indeed a dialect of Phoenician, not Arabic. A 4,000-year-old, transformed, evolved, refined, modern Phoenician, but Phoenician nonetheless. To this point, French sociolinguist Louis-Jean Calvet famously wrote that les Français parlent aujourd'hui latin, mais un latin qui a 20 siècles d'âge et qui est marqué par un substrat germanique, par le parler de nos ancêtres gaulois. In other words, the French today speak Latin, but a Latin that is 20 centuries old and that is markedly influenced or built on a substrat of Germanic languages, the languages of our Gaul or Gallic, nos ancêtres Gaulois, our Gallic ancestors. Now, even Sateh al-Husri, the father of what I call coercive linguistic Arab nationalism, even he comes to term with this reality, and he puts it in writing in his foreword to Anis Fraiha's Al-Lahjat wa Uslub Dirasatiha, dialects and their teaching methodology. And Husri notes in this foreword that there are no dialects as such, but indeed languages in their own rights. So basically he saps his own notion of Arab nationalism that is built on the unity of the Arabic language and argues that there is no such unity, and those people that he wants to coerce into this idea of a single Arab nation don't even speak Arabic. I would add to Sateh al-Husri's notion suggested by Fraiha himself, and that is the vitality of so-called dialects and the atrophy of what we commonly call Arabic. Vitality and atrophy, of course, in the sense of spoken living languages in the case of what people call dialects, and ossified book languages that no one speaks, and that is in the case of the Arabic that Sateh al-Husri himself was advocating. Still, a long introduction to say that Lebanese is a language in its own right. It is not a dialect of anything, and that if it is a dialect, again, recalling Calvet's example, it is indeed a dialect of Phoenician, with a lexicon of some perhaps 50% or more Arabic, but with a substrat and phonological and other lexical habits that are markedly Phoenician. In the end, the language versus dialect distinction is an arbitrary one at best, a political, and I would argue an emotive dichotomy. Linguists, in fact, tend to ignore the binary of language dialect. They ignore it altogether, opting for the ideologically innocent term language variety or variety tout court as opposed to language and dialect, and thus normalizing the adage that says that language is a dialect with an army and a navy behind it. In other words, your dialect earns the honor of being called a language because you have an army, you have a political program to enforce that notion, whereas others who don't have an army and a navy are forced to denigrate their languages and refer to them as dialects. So, in other words, it is ideological, not to say authoritarian, fiat decree that makes one language a language per se and relegates another language to the lower status of a dialect. And I think political scientist Tristan Mabry described it best by proposing the binary language versus dialect is what he called a statement of power, not a statement of analysis. I would add to Mabry's power the role of emotion, not to say authoritarian national chauvinism, in subjectively dictating what is language and what is not. Lebanese is the result of centuries of multilingualism and convergences between Canaanite, that is Phoenician and Hebrew, but also Aramaic, Arabic, and other languages, Turkish, Persian, Latin, Greek, French, English. Certain syntactic constructions in Lebanese, such as rito laktebak, are best explained by Aramaic, while some of the lexicon might draw on Arabic. For example, we could argue that qara'a, from which in Lebanese we say iri or rito, that qara'a may be Arabic, but I argue that the Canaanite likro precedes Arabic by 2,500 years. So why do we say that rito laktebak is a deformation of Arabic or a Lebanese accent of Arabic when both the verb likro was present in Canaanite 2,500 years before the coming of the Arabs, or 3,000 years before the coming of the Arabs, and likewise kteb, ktebo, ktebak, ktebe are present also in Canaanite and Aramaic, preceding Arabic by some 2,500 years. So why don't we say that those those are present within our lexicon before the coming of the Arabs and Arabic? Many of the pronouns in Lebanese also seem to have an Aramaic source. For example, ktebe, ktebak, kteba, ktebo, ktebna. Those are not deformations or distortions of the Arabic kitabi, kitabihi, kitabuha, kitabuna. That's how they had been present in the language for thousands of years before the coming of the Arabs, and that's precisely how our Phoenician ancestors used those pronouns. Now, while some grammatical features may also be explained by Arabic, Arabic remains a latecomer, and I would argue an intrusion on a Canaanite substrat that remains dominant in modern Lebanese speech forms. That said, we must not ignore the huge influence that Arabic has had on all Middle Eastern languages, including Turkish and Persian. But by the same token, we must not ignore the large Canaanite and Aramaic component of the Lebanese lexicon, a lexicon that may be receding today due to the spread of literacy in Arabic and the prestige given to Arabic at the expense of spoken languages. Still, it is remarkable that People educated in Arabic assume such Lebanese words as ktib or rito must be distortions of the Arabic kitab and qara'tuhu. Nonsense. Again, I mentioned earlier that bin ktib and krito, likro, in Canaanite and Aramaic, and therefore in Lebanese for some 3,000 years before the coming of Arabs and Arabic. But linguistic totalitarianism, which is revealed in what is commonly referred to as literacy in Arabic, over time takes a toll. The case of English versus French, I think, is instructive and relative in this context, and I use it often in drawn parallels in my own classes for my students who don't know Arabic but can make distinction or parallel between French and English. For about 4 centuries after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, English and Norman French coexisted in England in what may be described as a diglossic situation, with Norman French as the prestige language, the high variety, and English as the low variety, the language of the commoners. Not only that, but the high variety, the low variety, the language of the commoners, English, over time began adhering closer to the prestige, to the high variety, to Norman French, to the point where English could have been said to be a dialect of Norman French. But that wasn't so, really. Linguists cannot legitimately argue that today's English is a dialect or a deformation or an extension of Norman French. Even if some 70% of modern English vocabulary may be attributable to French. For instance, the reason why the English word knife is written the way we write it, knife, as the Lebanese would read it, is because it comes from the French canif. But even if, and this is one example, there are many, so 60 to 70% of modern English vocabulary comes from French, and even though it does come from French, the English language is still a distinct language, not a French dialect. Language is not lexicon, or it's not only lexicon. The grammar is very important. I suggest the same situation can be observed in the case of Lebanon, where for a variety of doctrinaire considerations, modern spoken Lebanese is deemed a deformed Arabic, lahje or derij or ammiye or vulgar, basically a vulgar form of Arabic. In conclusion, synchronically, historically, Lebanese is a distinct language, regardless of what Arabists and Arab nationalists prefer to think. It's a sui generis, spontaneous, local generation, a collage of linguistic habits over the millennia that led to what the Lebanese speak today. Yes, but it's a language in its own right. It has been influenced and truffled with Arabic, just as it has influenced itself Arabic. But it has also been influenced by other languages, by Greek, by Latin, by French, Turkish, Persian, English more recently. But it remains a Lebanese spontaneous generation nonetheless, built on a substrate of Canaanite Aramaic languages. And again, I would conclude, and I'll stop here, with a repetition of what I began with, and that is, if it's a dialect of anything, it is a dialect of Phoenician. I'll stop here and I'll pick up with a second installment. I think arbitrary as it may be, the dichotomy or the binary language dialect deserve to be visited. So I'll talk a little bit about those. Thanks for sticking around. Ciao.